For anybody who's new to this channel, I just want to say once again why I'm doing this whole series. It's to help me learn how to speak more fluently and stuff. And so I'm doing everything without any kind of notes or outline or teleprompter or anything. I'm just speaking off the top of my head. And I'm picking up on bad speech patterns that I have, and I'm trying to correct those and stuff. And yesterday, I tried to record the video that I'm about to record now, and it went horribly wrong. I had all kinds of brain farts, and it was so bad that I decided not to upload it. I actually did 2 takes yesterday, and both of them were awful. And then I got all depressed yesterday about it and everything, and I decided, okay, I'm just going to step back and try it again today. So part of the problem I think that I had was that the subject I'm discussing today is much easier to explain if you can do it on a piece of paper, draw little timelines and number lines and dots and stuff like that. But I'm trying to do it all verbally. And so that's a difficulty. But I'm going to try it again today. I kind of rehearsed this in my head. I came up with a different way to explain it. And so, and it went very smoothly in my head. So we'll see what happens when it comes out of my head through my mouth. Okay, so imagine a number line. You got 0 in the middle and all the positive numbers to one side and the negative numbers to another. And okay, so imagine between 0 and 1, you got a whole bunch of points. You got one at the halfway point, one at the 1/4, an 1/8, a 16th, 32nd, 64th, etc. And so, as you can imagine, dividing this line, this is what a lot of people call a potential infinite, because you can keep dividing that line forever and ever and ever. There's no end to your ability to divide that line. So that's called a potential infinite. An actual infinite would be a situation where you actually completed that process. And if you think about it, it's impossible to complete an actual infinite by doing one step after another, and I explained that in the previous video. Well, let's imagine just crazily enough that somehow just, instead of doing it one after another, we just said, poof, there they all are. Now we're not doing it one step after another. We're just assuming that the line has already been divided, the points are already there, and let's assume for the sake of argument that it's actually infinite. If that were the case, then at the half point, you'd have a discrete point, and then you'd have one at the quarter and everything. But at the 0 end, when everything starts bunching up and getting closer together at the 0 end, the crazy thing about this scenario is that there would not be a first point closest to 0. And the reason is because it's infinite. Every point has a point that comes before it. So no matter what point you pick, there will be another point between that point and 0. And so there is no first point. Now, that may not seem like a contradiction exactly, looking at it like that, but it actually is a contradiction. And that contradiction becomes apparent when you start, imagine this number line is actually a timeline, and each point represents a point in time. And so if you start attaching consequences to reaching those points, then the contradiction becomes apparent. So let's imagine that each one of those points on the timeline is actually a Grim Reaper. And they're all asleep. And so when their time is up, when you get to their point in time, that Grim Reaper wakes up. And if you're alive, it kills you. There's a non-violent version of this thing. If you want to read about Grim Reaper paradoxes and stuff like that, there's a book by Alexander Pruss. I can't remember the name of the book right now. I'll put a link in the description, though. Anywho, he's got a non-violent version of this, but I'm going with the violent one because that's the first one I heard. Okay, so the Grim Reaper wakes up, and he checks to see if you're alive or dead. If you're dead, he does nothing. He just goes back to sleep. But if you're alive, he kills you instantly. You just die instantly, and then he goes back to sleep. So the question is, if you were alive at the beginning of this series, would you be alive or dead at the end of it? Well, clearly, you couldn't survive, because if at any point during this interval of time you were alive when a Grim Reaper woke up, well, it would kill you. So if you were alive at the halfway point, the Grim Reaper would kill you. So it's impossible for you to survive this series. But here comes the contradiction. If there's no first Grim Reaper, then which one of them kills you? See, none of them can kill you. And the reason is because for any point you reach, any Grim Reaper you reach, that Grim Reaper cannot kill you because the Grim Reaper before it will have already killed you if you were alive. And you would have been alive, because we're just stipulating that in the scenario. So it's impossible for any Grim Reaper to kill you. And yet it's also impossible for you to live. So the contradiction, you're alive and you're not alive. That's a contradiction. So that's the Grim Reaper paradox. Now, how this applies to an infinite past is this. If the past is infinite, then it is possible to create an actually infinite scenario, like I said, with an actually infinite number of Grim Reapers set to kill you at a particular moment in time. And it can be set up like this. Suppose an hour ago, a Grim Reaper was set to go off at the halfway point. An hour before that, it was set to go off. Another one was set to go off at the quarter point. And an hour before that, one was set to go off at the 8th point, etc., etc. And so if the past has no beginning, and this has been going on forever, then there would be an actually infinite number of Grim Reapers that had been set in the past, and therefore there would be an actually infinite number of Grim Reapers in this interval. And since there's no first Grim Reaper that was set, there's therefore no first Grim Reaper in this interval of time. And so, if the past is infinite, then this Grim Reaper scenario could be set up. And if this Grim Reaper could be set up, then you would have a contradiction in reality. But since you cannot have a contradiction in reality, it follows that the past cannot be infinite. So this proves with logical certainty that there cannot be a past. An infinite past, an actually infinite past, generates a logical contradiction, and therefore it is impossible. Now, one of the most common objections I've heard to this argument is that time is discrete. In other words, instead of having this smooth, continuous, moment-to-moment kind of thing, you actually have a smallest unit of time. So it's like a film strip. You have a picture and a picture and a picture and a picture and stuff. If it goes fast enough, you can't tell that it's pixelated. But time is pixelated. There are several reasons for why I don't think that's a good... So given if time is pixelated like that, well, then it would follow that you cannot set up this scenario because there's a limit to how close together two Grim Reapers can be. Once you reach that limit, you can't go any farther. And so it's impossible to carry out this scenario with an infinite number of Grim Reapers since they get infinitely close together. So that's the objection. And I don't think the objection works. And I've got a few reasons. And I butchered this yesterday when I tried to explain these reasons. So hopefully I'm not going to butcher it today. But if I do butcher it, just in the name of transparency, I'm going to go ahead and post this video anyway. But in the meantime, I'm going to post a link to that. I'm going to post a link to that blog entry that I made about this so that you can hopefully read the coherent version of what I'm about to explain. So let me go ahead and explain it. First of all, it's not certain that time is quantized like that. Nobody knows that. In loop quantum gravity, time is quantized. It does come in discrete little packets and stuff. In string theory, it does not. And there's a bunch of other theories. 2 or 3 years ago, when I was really looking into this whole Grim Reaper paradox, and I was trying to get to the bottom of this question. I read around a lot of stuff on the internet. I read some papers. I even talked to some physicists and stuff to try to get to the bottom of this thing. And the end result of my quest to get to the bottom of this is that nobody knows whether time is quantized or not. That's the bottom line. I did find 2 papers that seem to show that time is not quantized, because under the assumption that time is quantized, they expected a certain result, but since they didn't get that result, that casts doubt on whether time is actually quantized. So I personally am very doubtful about time being quantized, and I have other reasons for doubting that time is quantized, but anyway. But let's suppose time is quantized. Would that undermine the argument from Grim Reaper? I would still say no. And the reason is because what the Grim Reaper paradox shows is that an infinite past is logically contradictory. It doesn't matter whether you could actually carry out the Grim Reaper paradox in physical reality or not. It's a logical impossibility, which means that if there is a possible world in which time is not quantized, then obviously the Grim Reaper paradox could be carried out in that world, and it would show that it's logically impossible for the past to be infinite. Well, a logical impossibility is a formidable thing. It's the kind of thing that carries over into all possible worlds. If you have a contradiction, that contradiction cannot be true in any possible world. And so if an infinite past is logically contradictory, then it can't be actualized in any possible world, including a world in which time is quantized. And so that's another reason. Another reason is, let's say it's merely possible that time is not quantized, or that it could have been not quantized or something like that. If that's even possible, then it would prove that it's an infinite past is logically impossible. And the reason is this: if it's possible, then you can imagine something like an all-powerful being like God interfering in nature and changing it to where for this brief moment of time is smooth and continuous, and maybe for the rest of time it's quantized, but just for this small interval it's smooth and continuous. Well, that would generate the Grim Reaper paradox, and an infinite past would be impossible. So here's the argument: if it's possible for God to make time smooth and continuous for a small interval of time, then it's impossible for the past to be infinite. It is possible for God to do that, therefore it's impossible for the past to be infinite. So it's a modus, I think that's modus ponens or whatever. Anyway, so just the mere possibility of that happening is generates the paradox. So I guess that's about it. I guess the only thing I want to add is that there are different versions of the Grim Reaper paradox, or I guess you could call them different arguments altogether. Let me say something about Thomson's lamp, because what's his name? Alexander Press discussed this in his book. Thomson's lamp is similar to it, except that you got an interval of time, and instead of getting closer and closer to zero, you get closer and closer to one. So like at the halfway point, and then you've got between halfway and one, and between that and the next one, etc., etc. So imagine that the light is off, and as you get to each of these points, the light gets turned on, and then it gets turned off, and then it gets turned on, and then turned off. And the question is, at the end of this interval, is the light going to be on or off? Well, to answer that question, you would have to know whether infinity was odd or even. But if there's no last member to infinity, then it cannot be odd or even. So there's just no answer to this question. It's just kind of nonsense. Now, Alexander Press said that the weakness of this argument is to make it go through, you have to be able to demonstrate that the principle of sufficient reason is true, and there was some other stipulations that had to be true, and I don't remember what they are. So he doesn't really put as much emphasis on that one. He does believe in the principle of sufficient reason, so I think he does think that argument also proves in the impossibility of an actual infinite, but I'm not sure. So another one I heard on Cameron Bertuzzi's channel. He called it the Grim Reaper messenger paradox. And I may butcher this up because I only heard this one time, but it's a situation where there's an infinite, during each hour or day or year or whatever in the past, there's a Grim Reaper, and throughout time they've been passing this message forward, and each Grim Reaper has a unique number assigned to it. And so when it gets that message, it looks at the message, and if there's a number on it, it doesn't do anything. It just passes it on to the next Grim Reaper. If there's no number on it, then it writes its number on there. And so the question Cameron asks is, when you get to the Grim Reaper, like right now, what number will be on his piece of paper? And the answer to that, well, that's kind of a paradox, because there is no first Grim Reaper. No matter what Grim Reaper, there has to be some number on there, because at some point, you know, I mean, if there was no number on there when the last Grim Reaper received it, then it would have written its number on there. So there's no way that the paper does not have some number on there. But at the same time, how could it have a number on there if for every Grim Reaper in the past, there was a Grim Reaper that came before it? With that scenario set up, there is no Grim Reaper that could have written its number on there, because any Grim Reaper that received the paper, it would already have a number on there. It would have had the last Grim Reaper's number on there at the very least, or the one before that, or the one before that, or whatever. So if the past is infinite, then there's just no answer to that question. It's a paradox, you know, it's an unsolvable paradox. Now, I think Cameron said that he didn't say that this shows that the past cannot be infinite. He said that it shows causal finitism, which is the idea that there can't be infinite causal series. Whether that causal series happens over a finite interval of time or an infinite interval of time doesn't seem to matter. I said I applied it to an infinite past by spacing the Grim Reapers an hour apart, equal intervals apart, either an hour apart or a day apart or a year apart. It doesn't matter. As long as they're spaced equally distant, that would seem to indicate that the past cannot be infinite. Because if the past were infinite, you could divide it like that. And that's about all I had to say about that. So up till now, I've given 6 arguments for why time had a beginning and why the universe had a beginning, because the universe just is time. It's space, time, matter, and energy and stuff. So if time had a beginning, then the universe also had a beginning. It is theoretically possible for the universe to have a beginning without time having a beginning, because you can kind of imagine, you know, there being something like a metaphysical or time or something like that. And I'm not going to argue whether something like that exists or not, because it's not really necessary. Anyway, there you have it. So in the next video, this one was difficult, but in the next one, the next thing I'm going to talk about is probably going to be the most difficult thing for me to talk about in this entire series that I'm doing. So wish me luck.